Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. Through the pandemic, a number of things have become evident. Educators at all levels had to fast-track incorporating technology into their lessons. Access to technology is not equal in all communities, and the way we look at education going forward will have to change if we are continuing to produce global citizens. To help us explore these issues and some possible solutions, today we welcome Josh Thomases, veteran educator and executive vice president at the Great Oaks Foundation, a charter school network that envisions every child with the support of a tutor and combats racism through investing in communities. Welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It's great to be here.
Well, before we actually get into today's class and so to speak, let's find out a little bit more about you and what you do. So where did you begin your career and how did you end up at Great Oaks?
I began my career as an AmeriCorps volunteer in 1995 at a community-based organization in Williamsburg, Brooklyn called El Puente that was founding one of the original New Visions high schools, the El Puente Academy for Peace and Justice, which was the first school dedicated to human rights, to our knowledge, in the country. I spent over a decade there and then went to work at the New York City Department of Education, where I played several roles. Primary one early on was overseeing the work on new small schools in New York City. I helped open over 354 public schools, mostly secondary schools, and also worked on charters and approved the opening of charter schools. I met the founder of Great Oaks, Michael Duffy, at the New York City Department of Education. And to make a long story short, a bunch of years later, he asked me to come join him to help work on some of the key issues going on at Great Oaks.
Excellent. Now, and give us a little bit of background on what Great Oaks does, because I understand there are actually two components to it. There's the philanthropical arm of it, and then there's the actual the school networking arm of it.
It's interesting. It's called the Great Oaks Foundation. We raise money, but we're not a philanthropy. We don't provide money to schools, though we have worked very hard to raise money for the schools that we helped open. Great Oaks was created initially as a school startup organization, beginning with our Newark campus just over 10 years ago. We opened schools built around a model of high dosage tutoring. And we opened schools in Newark, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Wilmington, Delaware, and New York City. And over the last couple of years, we've transitioned to playing really two roles. One, as a charter management organization where we manage several of those schools directly. And the second, as the provider of our Great Oaks Fellows, or our tutors, who are AmeriCorps volunteers who provide high dosage tutoring to students in both our Great Oaks schools and with other schools that have hired us to provide fellows in those schools, such as Baltimore Collegiate School for Boys in Baltimore and Amber Charter Schools in New York City.
You're beginning to open up a new school year. So as we enter that new year, especially within the pandemic, what are some of the causes for alarm that were raised by the last school year?
I am very concerned about what we don't know. What we do know is cause enough for alarm, but what I'm most concerned about is what we don't know about the lives and experiences of children over the course of the pandemic. What we do know is that across the country, attendance was counted as if a student clicked on even once during the day. That might have made sense when they were in-person school because a student walks through the door and you can reasonably assume that they're participating all day. But as we all know, that simply clicking on one link, Zoom link at the beginning of a day does not mean you attended school all day. And as best as I can tell, and I mostly have spoken to colleagues in the Northeast, is that schools were not counting or paying very close attention to how much students were showing up for each and every period. The schools with whom we work the most closely, we started counting 4 times a day, where students showing up to at least 4 of their classes as an internal measure. And we were able to keep that number approaching what our average would have been in person, 85 to 90%, slightly lower, but still in the ballpark. But what I was hearing from colleagues in districts and in charters who were not paying tight attention is that upwards of 30% of students were not meaningfully engaged in schools on a regular basis. And the more I thought about it as I talked to people, the more, and this is a technical term, but the more it became, we're not talking about unfinished learning or learning loss. We're talking about students with interrupted formal education who, for all intents and purposes, did not attend school. So that, and we know this, I've obviously worked in education for 30 years, we're accustomed to students coming from other countries who, because they were living on farms or because they were coming from a country in a war, may not have been in meaningful school. But we've not ever seen what it is to have thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of students, depending on the size of districts, where the habits of school, of getting up every day, of going to school, of doing homework, of taking notes, of participating in class, all are not in place. And as we prepare to reopen, we're asking ourselves, what has life been like for students over this last period of time? On top of that, you add 2 other components. Obviously, the academic component. What did they not learn? What did they not spend their time doing? What did they spend their time doing? And what did they not do? But then you also have, obviously, all of the issues related to the collective trauma that we've all experienced and what experts in the field tell us are likely were experiences of the children entering our schools. So if you talk to people involved in food scarcity, they say it was through the roof during the pandemic. You talk to people involved in domestic violence, they say it was through the roof during the pandemic. You talk to people around housing, they say homelessness, housing instability through the roof. In every bucket. And so our children are going to walk back into schools carrying all these stories and needing a place to land. And school's one of the last institutions this country has that can really be a place to land if we can create the safety for students. But it is very concerning what we're up against. And the last thing I'll say is, of course, it's not like our teaching force didn't experience their own sets of trauma in this moment. And we obviously have the collective trauma of the pandemic. And we finally have this national conversation or this latest stage of a national conversation reckoning around race and equity. That for those of us who are working in cities that are serving significant numbers of students of color needs to be in the dialogue as well.
Yeah, that answer, there's a lot to unpack there. And one of the things I want to touch on and to really clarify is it's amazing how, well, not necessarily amazing, but it's interesting how when we think about learning loss and that interrupted education, as you pointed out, we often think of that in terms of foreign students who are coming here from other countries, maybe even ELL students, but students who, for whatever reason, may have started school in their country, then they even coming here to begin school, then they go back to their country and they're not in school, then they come back here and now they're a year or 2 later, but there's that big gap. So they're older, but they still have the same level of education that they had when they left. And we don't think of that in terms of, well, now that's what's happening here. And students, they were here, they were present, like they didn't leave the country or anything. So what would cause that type of learning loss again? So now when we have this learning loss that's taking place, I guess, what do you think, what can we do to help with attendance and engagement? And I think it's more of the engagement factor, because even with attendance, students can come in and say and check off that I'm here, but then they leave their cameras off and then they walk away from the computer. So how can we increase the level of meaningful engagement for our students?
Well, I think it's really, first, it's worth saying that it's very different if you're talking about elementary school students, middle school students, or high school students. For elementary school students, you have a generation of kindergartners and first graders whose experience with school start is totally looks like it did 60 years ago before there was universal kindergarten. And so there's that set of challenges. For secondary school students, for middle school students, beginning of high school, we know that that's a very challenging time academically, and we see that in the national test scores. And so there's that issue. For juniors, seniors in high school at this point, we know that for families across the spectrum, if those families were facing food scarcity or housing scarcity, then they were grappling immediately with getting jobs and figuring out how to help contribute to the family wellness, general health. They don't want to give up those jobs. And so we need to approach school suddenly from a perspective of how do we help students finish their degree and not have to ask them to choose between contributing to their family's well-being and paying and finishing high school. And that requires policy issues at the state level and requires us to reorganize how we approach school. I think the last thing that I'll say on this goes to the sort of heart of your question. If we're going to have students be re-engaged, we're going to need to have them feel welcome and wanted, and that they're going to need to believe what I've said, which is that school is by far the best place, the best institution to really land young people. And so we're going to have to treat them as such and welcome them.
Yeah, and I think that also that one of the things that you mentioned or may have even alluded to in your previous response is, and one thing we need to remember is how the school has become like the hub of the community. And whenever things need to take place, there are a lot of resources that come through the school, and a lot of people will come to the school for those resources and not just for the academic piece of it. And so we may need to, when we're rethinking education, we may need to rethink the model of the community school and exactly what the community school was all about when it was first originated.
Yeah, I mean, I think districts and community and local city councils investing additional dollars. Schools are not built for all the issues that land on their doorstep. And so pretending that teachers alone can handle this is unfair to everybody involved. But thinking about how do we make them that hub and how do we bring additional dollars out of city coffers to really make sure that there are social work supports, that there's access to healthcare, all of those kinds of things is a critical component. And then I think one of the reasons why high dosage tutoring or having the right to personalized attention, right? High dosage tutoring, very technical term, but just to say what it means that just like any parent would spend the money or the political social capital to get help for their young person, that every child should have that. And that if we invest in having fellows or tutors in our schools who can pay that kind of individualized attention to young people, who can welcome them, who can be in touch with families, not just when there's a crisis, but every week say, here's what's been going on this week. Here's what your child's done well. Here are their next steps. Those kinds of things build the net back and allow these young people to land, to make mistakes, to trip and fall and get up and actually begin to make progress.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is Josh Thomases, Executive Vice President at the Great Oaks Foundation. We talked about how we know that students are going to be coming back with this trauma baggage. Well, our teachers have a lot of it as well. What should schools be doing, and what are some schools such as Great Oaks doing to support teachers as well who are dealing with areas of trauma as well as the students?
I think we're learning a lot as a country about this conversation about how do we take care of ourselves. I think about our teachers as Olympic gold medalists. If we're going to succeed around education, it's because of the teachers in every classroom. It always is. All of the research suggests 3 years of extraordinary teaching can change a child's life. And like Olympic gold medalists, we've learned some things that we can't just hammer them over and over and over and over again. And as Simone Biles just taught us, sometimes they have to be able to say, I'm not ready to stand. And so I think our challenge is to create room for teachers to be in conversation with each other and to have room to say, I'm having a hard day, or this information that came through this child that just spoke to me and told me what was going on in their lives was in fact re-traumatizing to me around whatever were my particular experiences growing up, and that they need to have spaces to go, hotlines, or ability to go to the teacher's lounge and just talk to another teacher and say, that was crazy and really hard and really challenging. And we're teachers, and our job is on behalf of the children that we serve. And so somehow holding in balance these two pieces, that the reason we're all doing the work we do is on behalf of the 50 million children in this country, and that we have to show up each and every day while creating room to say, I need a break for a moment, I need some assistance, is, I think, the balance we need to find. At its heart, it's creating caring environments. And one of the things that I have learned throughout my entire career is that the way you treat the adults is the way they treat the children. And so if you want to create safe learning environments for children, and you want to create caring learning environments for children, then you need to create safe learning environments for adults and caring environments for adults. And so I think the onus is on us as administrators, as leaders of organizations, on leaders of districts, on leaders of schools, to create what room we can. And what I would just say to the teachers out there is, first, thank you for everything that you've done on behalf of children in this brutal, difficult time. I'm sorry we can't do everything we would want to do to create every safe spot we would want, just like you're struggling to do that for the children that you serve. And that together we're going to do our very best on behalf of both all of our common experience and on behalf of the students we're serving.
Let's shift gears a little bit and get into this idea of high dosage tutoring. Exactly, once again, what is it? How did Great Oaks come up with it? How do you fund it? How do you man it? How does it actually take place in a typical school day?
First, I'm going to say the term one more time, and then we're going to put it to the side. Why do we use that term high dosage? It really talks about two different key points that are at the heart of the Great Oaks model. The first is the idea that it's for every child, that every child has the right, that this isn't because you're particularly behind or particularly advanced or just you're in the middle, but that we want to create organizations and schools where every child that gets this kind of personalized attention. And the second is the idea that it's not only for every child, but it's for every child regularly, at least 90 minutes a week in ELA or English Language Arts, and at least 90 minutes a week in math sciences. And so that's the heart of the logic. The model was first created by Match Charter School in Boston. It's sort of grown out from there. Michael Duffy was the founding board chair of the Match Charter School. And so that's the connection here, and became the founder of Great Oaks. Our program is an AmeriCorps program. So we receive a grant from the federal government to, at this point, we have 360 AmeriCorps volunteers who work across our different schools. And in our schools, they play three key roles. We call them Great Oaks Fellows because they don't just tutor. So the three key roles are, the first is instruct. So that is tutoring. They work alongside a teacher, either in their classroom or in pull-out tutorial with groups of approximately 4 students, where they work on specific skills, either around acceleration, around remediation, or around the work that's happening in the classroom. So they might, for example, if they're reading a book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, they might be reading texts related to that book during tutorial, or they might be studying vocabulary. Or many schools now do drop everything and read periods where students read a book of interest together, and you might have a fellow read that book with them. In math, they might be doing practice so that you get really good at the math that's being taught, or they might help a student who's struggling in the math understand some of the underlying skills so that they can catch up. That's the first big role. The second big role is, once you have an AmeriCorps volunteer in a school for 1,700 hours over the course of a year, then it's going to feel obvious what the next two pieces are. The second is mentor. They provide mentorship to the students. They are near peer mentors, mostly recent college graduates. And in the case of Great Oaks, over 2/3 of them are people of color. And so they look like the students, and they can model for the students, whether they look like them or not, what it was like to achieve this goal of to and through college. And that mentoring looks different, certainly if you're mentoring high school students versus sixth graders, but in every case, there's context in which they're helping students set goals and helping students see themselves as having this opportunity to get to and through college. Set goals for themselves, talk about their challenges, and figure out their path forward. A critical part of that is also being in touch with families. The first one's instruct, second one's mentor, the third one is develop. They contribute to the community in any one of a number of ways, from service projects as part of AmeriCorps on Martin Luther King Day or on September 11th, to being part of after-school programs, joining the arts programs, joining sports programs. We've had amazing fellows who are singers and dancers and athletes, and they bring those skills and find out how to contribute to the school. And then the final piece of that develop is they're just another adult presence. So if there's a lot of kids in the schoolyard and you need some more adults, well, part of an AmeriCorps Members Day can be being with the teachers in the schoolyard and helping to set up games so that you don't have three poor teachers trying to be in charge of a lunch of 200 students. You could have three teachers and a half dozen fellows, and the fellows can be running activities. And suddenly you have a much healthier, more engaged lunch hour.
It sounds like you are truly creating a village to raise the children there. And I like the model, that three-pronged approach, not necessarily approach, but the three tiers of the tutoring that takes place. So it's not just academic, it's also the mentoring. And then that third piece that often gets overlooked is, again, that community involvement and community development, because a lot of times, and there are a lot of schools that utilize AmeriCorps volunteers or Teach for America or whatever the organization is that's providing them. But then when that bell rings at the end of the day, they leave. And so now by providing or having them stick around to provide additional supports, and whether it's, like you said, providing that extra hand during recess or during lunchtime, or getting involved in the drama, after school drama clubs or things like that, now there's more of a stake in the environment, more of a stake in the community that the tutors have. And I think that goes a long way in the overall development of children. Because we talk about educating the whole child. Well, part of that education is how accessible the adults are to the children. And when they see that these people that they have become, they've started to trust, not only to give them their academic piece and to provide some sort of mentoring, but when they see that they can go to them at just about any time of the day, that goes a long way to their emotional stability and development. So I think that model is a very powerful one that you all have developed.
Yeah, you really just captured it well, Kevin. That is the heart of our aspiration, and what we're really working for. And there have been schools we've been working with for a decade who have really brought that to life, and there have been schools that we've started working with in the last 18 months. And and building that partnership takes time, and it takes a real willingness and commitment on the part of leaders. It is a lot of 21-year-olds in your school, and they bring enormous energy and enthusiasm. And where we have committed leaders, they've really created a great community for them and allowed them to contribute enormously. And remarkably, and perhaps unsurprisingly, where we've done this well, you end up seeing a significant number of our fellows go into teaching through our residency program. But also, if they decide they don't want to be teachers, they become our school support deans, our school culture deans. They go into operations, they go into technology. If you visit one of our schools that have been working with fellows for years and you talk to the ops director, more likely than not, they used to be a fellow. You talk to the person in charge of technology, more likely than not. And so this really has become a pathway for so many who started with a year of service to consider a career in education, whether they decide their passion is in the classroom or in support of the classroom.
So let me shift gears just a little bit here and talk about some of the, I guess, the lessons that were learned through the pandemic last year. I don't know if Great Oaks had gone strictly to a virtual learning environment or not, or it was a hybrid model, but what were some of the lessons that were learned regarding the use of technology in our classrooms?
Yeah, so we tried it all. At one point, we were in person. At one point, we were hybrid. And then at several points during the year, we had to go remote as the pandemic wound its way. I think we had some ideas that we thought would be fantastic. For example, we thought it'd be possible with fellows to run a hybrid classroom where there was a teacher in front of the kids in front of the classroom and a fellows online tracking the students online. That turned out to be far too complicated and far too difficult. And so I share with humility of a practitioner being in the work. I think the big things that I would say is that, first of all, our teachers learned so much about how to use so many technology tools, more than I could remotely capture. They know so much. I've been in education 30 years. So at this point, when I started, it was actually chalk and a blackboard. So they know so much more than I do now. But it was amazing to watch them learn. And if that whole adage, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Suddenly, all of these different tools that exist in online and understanding how to use them to create classroom conversations, to have dialogues, to codify student learning, to demonstrate student learning, were really helpful. And different teachers found different things and had different things work for them that had to do both with their instructional style, the class that they were teaching, and the age and skill level of the students. I think a big takeaway is that it's really possible to flip the classroom. And then instead of having classes organized so the teacher's doing the talking and the kids are sitting listening, that suddenly when classes are together is precious time for students to be in dialogue with each other around the knowledge. And homework can become the place where if you have the teacher who can really explain how to multiply fractions the best, that you can just watch that video and then come do a little homework around it and come into class ready to talk about what you learned from the video and the like, and ready to struggle with it. And that flipping is really useful because far too often school's pretty boring while our students sit passively and listen to our teachers do their level best to try to share with them what they know. And if you flip it and say, no, your job is to listen when we're not around so that when we are around, we can have you in dialogue with each other. We can have you trying interesting things with the information, and we can have you doing the most important thing, which is struggling and failing in front of us, right? If this were, anything, pick whether it's cello or baseball, you would never have the teacher of cello or a pitching coach sit there and lecture somebody for a half an hour and then say, go home and practice while I'm not watching. Right. You would always have them be like, okay, you can go listen and do this, but while we're in front of me, I need to be seeing you practice because that's the only way I can give you feedback. And that flipping is a big part of what we did, and using all these tools to have those conversations happen more and more. The reality of the online space is that nobody can tolerate being talked to for very long. In meetings, adults can't do it. So, really figuring out how to shorten those times and move them out of the central effort of classes, I think probably the most interesting learning.
We'd like to thank our guest, Josh Thomases, veteran educator and executive vice president at the Great Oaks Foundation, for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It was great to be here.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.